Hello and welcome everyone on this Saturday morning to CNPS Riverside San Bernardino presentation of the Kawia concept of nature. I want to tell you a little bit about CNPS. Before we get started, just to let you know who we are. California's native plants are what make California look like California, from the Joshua Tree of the Mojave Desert to the redwood forests of the North Coast. We are lucky to live in one of the most botanically rich places on Earth with more types of native plants than any other state in the US. And it is my understanding than any of the, we have more different plants than all of the contiguous states in the US. So California is special. We think that's worth celebrating and protecting, and we invite you to join us. CNPS is a nonprofit organization made up of more than 10,000 members. We have 35 local chapters throughout California, including Baja. And together we're working to conserve wildlands, protect endangered species, collect data, and restore nature to our home and public landscapes, one garden at a time. We are the voice for plants in California, and plants need us now more than ever as we face the combined challenges of climate change, extinction crises, and growing development pressure. But we need them too. None of us, not insects, birds, nor us, can exist without them. So when we save plants, we save everything else. If you're inspired by what you see and hear today, please consider getting involved. Become a member by visiting cnps.org/join, or you can sign up to receive emails and learn more about what we're doing at cnps.org/get-connected. Now for a couple of announcements, and then I will introduce you to everyone who's working on our show today. The board is interested in having more people help with the chapter. If you are local to Riverside San Bernardino, and in our other presentations, we've had people from as far away as India, but if you would like to help put on our shows or help schedule our field trips or help with membership, we do have positions available, and anyone is welcome. And you don't need to have, sometimes people think, oh my gosh, I have to be a botanist to be on the board, but you don't. You just, people with business experience can be super helpful, or if you're just an organizing kind of person, or if you just like to get into the weeds of what makes a chapter run, we'd love to have you. And our board meetings are not like other board meetings. I have keyed plans during the meetings, and okay, maybe I wasn't supposed to, but we did. So that is rsbcnps@gmail.com if you would like to get involved. So I want to, before we introduce our speaker, I'd like to introduce our tech host, and also Katie, who's helping us take questions. So our tech host tonight is Ed Harrison, and if he pops in, you'll know that it's probably because something went wrong. So, hey Ed, thank you. And then Katie Barrows will be taking your questions, and please put them in the question and answer. We will also try to scavenge the chat, but please, if you possibly can, there's a question and answer, a couple little bubbles that say Q&A. Put your questions in the question and answer. And now I'm going to introduce our speaker, Gerald. Gerald Clarke's family has lived in the Anza Valley. Hi, Gerald. For time immemorial. As an enrolled member of the Kawia band of Indians, Gerald lives in the home his grandfather built around 1940 on the Kawia reservation, and currently oversees the Clarke family cattle ranch. He is also employed as an assistant professor at the University of California, Riverside, where he teaches classes in Native American studies. Gerald is very involved in the reclamation and preservation of traditional Kawia culture. And he does have a website, www.geraldclarke, that's Clark with an E, .net. So, hi, Gerald. Welcome.
Hello, good morning. Yeah, so thanks for that. And thank you for the invitation to speak this morning. And I want to thank all the participants who are here taking time out of your Saturday to spend a little time with us. And so I have a lot to say, so I'm going to jump right in. And let's see here. There we go. So hopefully you can all see my slide pretty well. So yeah, my name is Gerald Clarke. I'm talking to you today from the Kawia Indian Reservation. And I wanted to start with, with a disclaimer. First of all, I'm going to be speaking in pretty broadly and in some generalities because the topic we're going to be discussing today isn't something you learn in a 45-minute lecture, nor is it something you can acquire in an academic school year or even a decade. This is lifelong learning that is happening and that you go through. And you know, I remember when I got my master's degree, and I just thought that was ridiculous that you know, at the age of whatever it was, 24, that I was considered a master of anything, because that's just not how it all works in my mind. And so I just want you to know that yeah, we're going to be just kind of breezing through some things. And so this idea, the concept or the Kawia concept of nature, first point that I'd like to make is it doesn't exist. Okay, and so I titled it like that. But really, this lecture, right? What I'm really going to be talking about is a Kawia concept of nature, and it's my own kind of concept of nature, because you know, one of the things I do in a lot of my classes is I'm dispelling this idea that there's such a thing as Native American, right? It's hundreds, if not thousands, of different tribal communities, right? Each existing in unique environments and having unique stories and understandings of the world, and even within the Kawia world, right? I'm up here in elevation of about 4,000 feet. And my cousins, the desert Kawia down there in the Coachella Valley, they have a very different environment. And so it's actually, you know, it's not a singular thing. You know, the indigenous communities here in California are diverse, right? And it's always been that way. And so what I'm presenting this morning is my own ideas about the Kawia concept of nature. And it's not that it's singularly me. My ideas are formed by the things I learned from other tribal members and elders and teachers, but also, you know, my knowledge of our creation story and protocols for going out and understanding the world around us. And so I wanted to start with that kind of concept before we really get into it. So I am talking to you today from my home here on the Kawia Indian Reservation. So there's a little map, gives you kind of a sense of where I'm at. Again, about 4,000 feet in elevation, and with a very particular, right, ecology and available plant life, animal life, etc. And so that's my positionality. That's what I'm coming to you from. And that's what helps form my ideas about this concept of quote unquote nature. Now, when I ask people to define nature, well, it's pretty expansive, right? And the analogy I always use is I think the concept of nature is almost like breathing, okay? Now, before I said the word, most of us don't think about consciously breathing. We just do it, right? And I think nature is so all encompassing, this concept, that you know, it is, right? It's like breathing. We do it, we're a part of it, etc. And so that's kind of, you know, like the beginnings of maybe understanding what I think about when I think about that concept of nature. But I also think that nature, this idea of nature, really forms a key basis for misunderstanding between indigenous peoples, not just here in California, but globally, right? and the colonizers, right? The immigrants who come into a new area, who come into a new environment. And we're going to talk, I think one of the ways that I want to approach this is, let's talk about concepts of nature in order to really understand maybe a Kawia concept of nature and how that's different. So a lot of times, and I commandeered this diagram, that's the recycling, reuse, recycle, reuse, repurpose diagram there. And I think this is kind of the idea that we have in contemporary society, right here in America, of what nature is. So it's a mixture of the climate and the environment. We're going to include land with that, plant life and animal life. Okay, and these things kind of work together in this system, right? But I often see this in contemporary discussions about nature and the environment, and I think there's a major missing element to that diagram, and what's missing is us, human beings. Now, let me apologize to you. I'm using this diagram, the male, the female, just to kind of represent, it's a simple symbol, right? But I do understand that humanity has always identified, right? Our gender identification is on a spectrum. It's not just a binary, but that was just the symbol I used to represent humanity, okay? And so this idea that we are outside of nature, right? I think is part of the problem of contemporary society, that we don't, we see ourselves separated from the idea of climate and the environment and plant. Now, we certainly have an influence on that. We have an impact, mostly negative, but we see ourselves as outside of that system. And indeed, when you look at literature, when you look at culture, European culture, right? Christian ideologies, when they were brought here into the Western Hemisphere, you look and you have this idea of like the forces of nature, right? And that sounds kind of scary, right? The forces of nature. And indeed, when you look at, again, literature, you look at Melville's Moby Dick, you look at Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. It's these themes that you see. You also see it in visual art, right? Is, you know, that humankind or man is battling nature, right? And there's this like oppositional kind of approach to the natural world, okay? And so this is the kind of ideology that was brought to these lands, right, through colonization. Another kind of ideology is this idea of seeing the natural world as a resource, and as a resource to be used in the generation of wealth, right? It's not specifically survival, right? It's the generation of wealth, okay? And so this is what we're dealing with. And, you know, I always say to my students that I'm a walking miracle, okay? And had the California gold rush happen in Southern California, I probably wouldn't be here today. My ancestors would have been completely wiped out. And indeed, the gold rush in Central and Northern California was devastating to indigenous peoples, but also to the environment. And so I feel very fortunate that I and my daughters and my extended family, that we're even here, okay? And this idea of mining, right? I think we can look at it now and we can say, oh yeah, there were some devastating effects. And yet we praise this kind of gold mining history. It's on your driver's license printed, right? And even today, there are gold mining television shows on like the Discovery Channel. So this idea of mining, of natural resources, of taking out of nature for the generation of wealth is still very much alive. And there are protests and there are issues, environmental issues that are going on across the globe. And it's the same ideology. Now, the good news is I see, like, particularly in academia, that this idea of, you know, there used to be maybe departments of natural resources or programs, and they're slowly transitioning into sustainability studies, which I fully support. And I think we're starting to see that kind of turn. The question is, how many centuries is it going to take for American culture to make that transition? Now, when we talk about an indigenous idea of nature, we bring humanity into the system, okay? And so maybe you think it looks like something like this, right? Where humans are involved with the climate and the environment. We're involved with the plant life. We're involved in the animal life. And we are a cog in the system that makes this system work, okay? Now, look, sounds good, right? I hate this slide, right? And I think this actually represents probably contemporary environmentalist movements here in the United States, because you see what it does? It centers humanity right in the middle, and everything's revolving around us. And I don't think that's indigenous at all. I don't think that's a Kawia view of nature. And I think this is a better slide, that we are a cog and that we work and we have a relationship with the plant life. We have a relationship and an obligation to the animal life, to the land, to the climate, to the environment. And so I think this simple little diagram, and again, this is lifelong learning right here. This simple little diagram, I think, begins to kind of spell out why and how it's important to consider ourselves part of the system, okay? And there's an anthropologist by the name of Dr. Lowell Bean, and he studied the Kawia. I think he's in his 90s. Lowell, if you're on here, I apologize if I'm painting you older than what you really are. But he talks about this idea of a reciprocal obligation belief system that the Kawia had with the world around us. So this reciprocal obligation, right, was this belief that we're only a part of the larger interactive system, right? Composed of cooperating entities that shared responsibility in the workings of the universe. And indeed, when in the Kawia creation story, when the twin creators, Mukut and Temiyawet, when they begin creation, the first thing that Mukut creates is tobacco, is a plant, okay? And the twins smoke before they start in creation. So it wasn't like humans were made first. No, it was the plant that was made first. And I think that paints an ideology, that paints a worldview to see that we are not the center of things. There are other things. And again, this idea of cooperating entities. The plants help us, we help the plants. The animals help us, we help the animals. And it's the same with the environment and even the climate. And so indeed, when we think about the Kawia idea of nature, I can't think of any Kawia words for nature, okay? Now we have a word for tree, like a generic word, like representing tree, and then we have the different names of all the different trees in our environment, okay? We have a name for the animals, right? We have a name for snake, but then we have a specific name for every one of the different types of snakes in our environment, okay? But when it comes to nature, and again, nature is not outside of ourselves. In child development, they say a child is around 2 or 3 and comes into this realization that they are autonomous, that they are not part of their mother or their parents, right? And I've even heard, right, that as soon as you name something, it's outside of yourself. But for many indigenous cultures, that concept of nature, it actually doesn't exist, okay? And so this idea of reciprocal obligation, right? This ecological ethic of gathering only what was needed, right, for survival, but also leaving some of those resources for those other beings, right? And so by practicing this reciprocal obligation, along with performing the appropriate ceremonies and rituals, it maintained this balance in the world. And one of my friends, one of my teachers, Daniel McCarthy, he was an archaeologist for the San Bernardino National Forest Service, and he fought for local Native peoples to enable us to go into the forest and to gather, to practice our historic and traditional foraging that is part of our culture, right? And he fought the Forest Service to get us that privilege. But in the minds of the Forest Service, the Indians would go into the forest, rape the forest, and there'd be nothing left. And that belief system is completely in opposition to what we do as a people and this idea of reciprocal obligation. And so just yesterday, I went out, it's yucca blossoms are being harvested right now, and I'll talk about later, one of our great foods. But he fought to get us these special passes. So I put this on my dash when I go out foraging. And part of my reciprocal obligation is this kind of responsibility, right? So Barbara Drake, a Tongva elder who passed recently, as well as Daniel McCarthy has, she would always say, well, you leave something. You don't just take, you leave something. So maybe you offer tobacco, or maybe even a sprig of your hair in thank you, right? In appreciation to the plants. I actually don't do that, or I have done that. But when I go out and gather, I always come home with my pockets full of trash, because people are going out to these rural areas, these secluded areas, and they're dumping their trash. And so it's so sad. I come home, my pockets are full of trash. A lot of times I have a bag of trash. That's how I give back, because I feel, yeah, you don't just take, it's this responsibility. And you don't take it all either. When my daughters and I go out and gather the yucca blossoms, we never take over a quarter of the blossoms from any single plant, because we want those plants to produce seed and propagate, right? And continue. That's a sustainable way of gathering. So one of my heroes, and I believe I saw her name in the participant list this morning, is Lorraine Siskwa. And there, I interviewed Lori several years ago, and there's a quote. She said she believes that the environment is set up to be used. And she said she feels bad about allowing plants to go unpicked, and that they'll feel uncared for. And you see that perspective is completely, I think, opposite of what the Forest Service officials were thinking about what the Native people will do. And she told me that she remembers a tribe in, I think it was in Arizona, that their word for oak grove translated into "they wait for us." That is a relationship. It's a relationship to the plants and the animals and the environment, right? And it's not just a one-way relationship, it's giving and taking. So indeed, when I go up and gather acorn in the fall, again, I'm picking up trash, I'm trying to pull away any dead branches or leaves away from the tree. And this is part of that reciprocal obligation, right? Our human obligation to the plants. And that's what keeps this system going. So continuing on, Lori said, the importance of gathering to us as human beings. I gotta tell you, yeah, they're great foods, right? You can go out and you can forage and various plants, you gotta know what you're doing, but they're good and they're good for you. But simply the act of going out, working for your food, being in the environment, interacting with the plants and the animals, feeling the sun on your head, it's good. It's a great substitute, probably the best substitute for depression meds and things like that, right? And she says there that healing the earth is healing ourselves, and I believe that, and I found that to be true over and over again. And so the other thing is this idea of this kind of practice and this view. It's not a divided thing. It's our language, it's our spirituality, it's our survival, and our stories. It's all connected. And so, what's really popular these days is this idea of indigenize education, indigenize the classroom. And, some people think that's simply putting up some signs and doing a land acknowledgement. And I teach at UC Riverside, and if you really want to indigenize, first thing you have to do is destroy all the departments and all the divisions between the different disciplines, right? And if you really want to indigenize it, and like Lori says there, right, it's not divided. Language, spirituality, survival, our stories, it's all connected. And that's where contemporary academia loses track, because you have these different specializations, right? These disciplines, no interaction much between the different disciplines. And so this kind of life, this practice, right, has a name, and it's called traditional ecological knowledge, TEK or TEC, okay? And it refers to this ecological management practices formed over generations. And indeed, anytime I see Lori, and maybe we're all out gathering together or we run across each other, I never see Lori gathering by herself. A lot of times she has her children with her and her grandchildren. This is how this gets perpetuated, through observation, experimentation, experiencing it, right? And long-term relationships. right? America tends to have this short attention span and can't really dedicate itself to these long-term relationships with the plants, the animals, the climate, and the environment. And indeed, Native peoples here in California often planted and propagated shrubs and grasses that were completely inedible for human beings. Okay, oh, so why did they do that? Well, they knew that they were edible for various other food sources like animals. Okay, so quail, rabbit, deer, antelope, elk. And so when we think about indigenous cultures here in the Western Hemisphere or here in California, right? Oftentimes anthropologists and historians will characterize us as hunter-gatherer societies, right? And along with that is this kind of implication that our survival was very iffy, right? That it wasn't insured. But the thing is, and indeed, when you go hunting or fishing, you're not always successful these days, right? But these cultures, our culture, we had our thumb on the scale, right? We knew where the animals were when we went hunting because we planted their food source for them. We observed, we knew when they would be there. And we knew what the plants were, and we knew where they grew. We knew when best to harvest those plants that was beneficial for the plant as well as for the people. And so this knowledge here, it's what I think this is agriculture. There were no long rows of lettuce. There were not fields of corn or wheat, but this is very much agriculture. And anthropologists, a lot of times they gauge, right, cultures by whether they had this idea of agriculture. When the Spaniards got here, they saw this beautiful garden that we call California, but because it was different from their own view of what a garden was, they couldn't see it, right? They literally couldn't see the forest for the trees. So MCAT Anderson kind of formulated this idea of traditional ecological knowledge by doing a series of interviews, and she has a book entitled Tending the Wild, right? So it's this knowledge built on a history gained through many generations of learning passed down from elders about practical as well as spiritual practices. And so this idea of TEK is a lifestyle custom designed and entirely sustainable for a specific environment. And this is very important because what the Kawia practiced here in Southern California would not work for the Ohlone up in San Francisco Bay Area. It will not work for the Modoc up in Northeastern California. It's specifically designed for specific environments. And over again, the federal government here in the United States and the Bureau of Indian Affairs passes these sweeping laws, right, governing all the Indians, right? But there's no such thing. Every tribe, every tribal community is going to be different and going to have a little bit different relationship, right, with their environment. And so over and over again, these sweeping laws that treat everyone the same, right? It doesn't align with this idea of custom design, sustainable lifestyles, okay? So how did the native people here, how did the Kawia people, how did we live in this environment? And particularly the desert regions, I think when the Europeans came here, they're like, how could anybody live here? And they were kind of blown away that there were people living here, right? And you know, you see it in books typically written by non-native authors that, well, you know, the Indians were spiritual and they, you know, were one with nature and they were intuitive like the animals. And, you know, it's this kind of dumbing down of us as a people. It's also a kind of stereotyping and a romanticizing of native people. But all this that I'm talking about here, and you're probably going to be surprised to hear these words put together in this lecture. What I'm talking about ultimately is an indigenous intellectual tradition. We were scientists, right? We were philosophers. We were astronomers. We were dietitians, right? There's all this stuff coming in together, right? No divisions, right? It's all coming together. Now, I know this is a plant society, so I felt the need to kind of go ahead and throw in some plants. So this is quinyali, which is acorn. Wiwish is our traditional dish that we make, shawi in the, I've heard in the Kumeyaay language. But they say at the time of contact that California Indians, like 70% of California Indians ate acorn on a daily basis. And it's really amazing. We go up, my daughters and I will go up into the mountains to gather acorn, usually October into November, and is when they're ripe. And it just so happens that's also the time of, those of you who are familiar with Southern California, the Santa Ana winds. So the winds come, they start knocking down the acorn. Sometimes you get sticks and bat them down as well, and you're gathering up. You never take them all, right? And they could be dried. And you can see there, one researcher suggested that that acorn could have actually supported population densities 50 to 65 times higher than those that they found that were here. So it's a superfood. It really is a superfood, and it's a specialized process to make our traditional dish, which, yeah, I do make. Chamish, or the holly leaf cherry. So another one of my teachers, my heroes, Willie Pink, he's really studied the holly leaf cherry, and the cherry has a very thin flesh around the seed, and it can be eaten, but it's the seed inside the pit that could be ground up and made into a dish that that could be dried, could be stored for long periods of times, and could be utilized, right, throughout the year. Panel, or the yucca whipplei, I think most of you should be familiar with this plant that grows throughout the Southwest, really. And the spiny parts at the bottom are a great source of fibers for cordage, for sandals, for rope, for blankets, things like that. You can eat the stalk before it flowers, and it's one of my favorite things. It tastes like a cross, raw. It tastes like a cross between like an apple and a celery. And then we also eat the blossoms. And I mentioned that my daughters and I, we go out and we gather some of the blossoms and boil it up. And we do kind of a modern fusion thing, but it's kind of like a floral cabbage, okay? And right now, right, lower elevations, it starts in like March, and they start flowering. And then as you come up in elevation, you get into April, May, and even into June and into the summer months. But I will say that I've come across several, recently, a number where someone has come along and just cut the stalk off about waist high, and then they're taking the top of the plant. And I do occasionally take a stalk because I like to eat it and cook with it. But when people do that, and I don't know if I've heard of non-native people using the top for like floral decoration. But I've also heard of native people cutting it off and then harvesting the flowers. The problem with that is a non-sustainable way of gathering those flowers, because once those flowers are pollinated, then it makes these small seed pods, which then dry and disperses the seed. So when you cut that stalk off, you're actually ending the life cycle of that plant, and it won't propagate more. So I want anyone who's doing this kind of thing, I want you to stop, right? Menukish is the mesquite beans. This is more down in the deserts. And the mesquite plant, the flowers were harvested in the spring and eaten. The green pods were collected in the summer and eaten. And the dried seed pods were collected late summer into the fall. And then because they were dried, they could be stored. Here's another one, the Agave Hearts. And anytime I bring up agave in my classroom, immediately my students begin to think about tequila. No. This is the desert agave, and it is harvested, and it's the hearts that are cooked in a pit over the span of a few days. And then when those are dug up, it's a very fibrous, tough kind of plant. But if you cook it a long time, it kind of softens it up, and you can slice it, and it's sweet, and it's, it reminds me of like dried mango, if you've experienced that. It kind of has that kind of sweet maple flavor, kind of mango flavor, but also mixed with smoke because of the way it's cooked. It's really a delicious thing. And the Malky Museum on the Morongo Indian Reservation, not this year, but typical year, they'll have the agave roast, and that's where this picture is from. And also Agua Caliente also does an agave roast, typically as part of their Tema Enenka Learning Day celebration that they have. So there's a couple examples of some of the plants, but I have to say I'm always apprehensive about sharing this knowledge with non-natives, because I don't want you to go out and just start cutting down plants and start pulling off blossoms or what have you. Because the fact of the matter is that because of the damage to the environment, you know, this traditional ecological knowledge was this system that was in place. It was a beautiful, sustainable system. And when the Spaniards came, when the missionaries came and set up the missions, they brought their livestock. And in the span of only 70 years, they devastated the environment here in California. And so this environment right now isn't set up to support the population of California. There is going to, you talk about long-term relationships, it's going to take a long time before the environment can repair itself, along with our help, right, to make it where we can, we might could be able to do more of this kind of thing. And then also the use of fire. That's a whole other lecture that you should be investigating, which is indigenous uses of fire to renew, to clean the forest, and to renew the plant life, and restore some of the natural health of our landscape. And so with that, I know I went fast because I was worried I would run out of time here, but it's important. And so I want to leave you with my closing thought. And again, I'm coming to you today from the Kawia Indian Reservation, and I'm a miracle, okay? And to be quite honest with you, our tribal communities here in California have lost a lot, okay? And if I focus on just everything that we've lost, I think I would fall into a depression that I probably wouldn't recover from. Instead, what I try to do is to focus on the miracle that I'm still here. I think Native people, indigenous people globally, we are the ultimate success story because we survived genocide. That's an amazing thing. And I'm very thankful to my ancestors, and I'm very thankful to my teachers. And I think I encourage this organization to continue these talks, and I can supply names of wonderful people who could expand much more beyond what I've said today. So in that closing thought, and this idea of resiliency in practice, that's who we are. It's an act of resistance. It's an act of survival that we're still here. And so I want you to know, because this is all going on, and the majority of California population doesn't know what's going on in our indigenous communities here in California. But I want you to know that somewhere in California, at this very moment, okay, a California Indian is singing an ancient song, preparing a traditional food, telling an ancient story, dancing like their ancestors, and caretaking the land. And I use that word ancient and traditional, but it's still being done today, the miracle, right? And so it's a contemporary practice. We are a continuum of our ancestors, and the knowledge is still being handed down. Some of it's been lost, definitely. I don't want to romanticize it. And indeed, there were indigenous cultures that didn't survive, that had disappeared, who couldn't get on board with this idea of TEK, tech, or sustainability. And they were gone long before Columbus got lost and stumbled into the Western tradition, or sorry, Western hemisphere. And so with that, I want to say, Achma Pe'ipachem Kal, which is that it's good that we were gathered today together. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your attention. And I think we're going to open it up for questions.
Excuse me just a minute.
Sure.
Great. Thanks so much, Gerald. That was wonderful and inspiring. And I appreciate your sensibilities about nature, which many of us share. I think all of us share, I'm sure. I have some questions for you. Actually, the first one from Chris Wagner is just asking for help with this statement you referred to with regard to indigenous intellectual, and he's asking for the last part of that phrase.
It's just, yeah, what I call it, it's the indigenous intellectual tradition. And you know, like to be honest with you, my background is in the visual arts. I'm a visual artist, and a lot of times people, they compliment me, and it's kind of a backhanded compliment. They say, "Oh, you're so talented," and that's always kind of rubbed me the wrong way, because they're dismissing 30 years of hard work and struggle to get where I'm at. And it's the same way with this idea of traditional ecological knowledge, that people want to say, oh, it's just because you're intuitive and spiritual and one with nature. No, no, this is science. This is an intellectual endeavor that shows our intellectual tradition, which has been ignored by Western, European and American academia until maybe very recently. And I will say there's an article recently in the Huffington Post about California, the state, looking at and considering indigenous use of fire to manage the forests. And I don't think it's true. I think they might be saying, oh yeah, we're going to do that. But acknowledging it and then actually practicing it, I think is two different things.
Great, thank you. So here's another question actually from Chris Wagner. Do the Kawia ever host traditional foods for the public?
The event I spoke of recently, at the Malky Museum, typically in the spring they have a agave roast. Now it's not happening this year because it's a virtual event, I believe, this year. But there are opportunities, and you just have to plug in and do your research. And there are probably opportunities up and down the state where you get to try these different types of food.
Great, thanks. We have a good number of questions, so I'll go through these. Jesus Reyes asks, for the yucca plant, is the practice to take the stalk when the plant is older, or how do you know when it's okay to take the stalk?
Well, I don't recommend taking the stalk at all, okay, because that plant won't seed if it's taken. But like rarely I'll take, it's certainly not every year even. I'll take one every now and then, occasionally. And what you do is you take the stalk when it's green, when it first emerges, but before it flowers. So, the sweetness in the flowers, that's what attracts the insects to pollinate those flowers. But if you take that stalk before it flowers, then the sweetness is in the stalk itself. But I highly recommend that you do not take any stalks, because that means that plant won't make seed. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Karen Davidson asks, do you have a more accurate term for hunter-gatherer? Is hunter-harvester an improvement? Thank you.
I've never been asked that. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I would have a separate term, but like I said, what is, I have a whole other lecture. What is a farm? Or what is agriculture? And I think that's what we have in California, right? And so I don't know if I would have another term for that. It was just a complete system that was set up. And it wasn't set up to advantage just human beings. It was set up to advantage the land, even erosion, right, was considerations, the plants, the animals. It was a complete system. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Excuse me. Benjamin Wood asks, you've mentioned a few books, but what other books would you recommend to learn more?
I'm glad you asked that, because I have some here. So this is Temalpach, and Kawia Indian knowledge and usage of plants. Maybe someone who knows can put that into the chat. Temalpach, from the earth. And it was published early 70s, I believe. And the information's good. It hasn't changed too much. But what I do is I take Temalpach and I pair it up with this little book, Roadside Plants of Southern California. Okay. And what I like about this little book is you can usually find it used for $2 or $3, but there's lots of color pictures of the plants. So by having this book and partnering it with the Kawia knowledge book, it's a pretty good little manual for going around Southern California and identifying plants. And then more broadly is this Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States, Restoring Cultural Knowledge, Protecting Environments, and Regaining Health. And I was asked to write the chapter on California, and I immediately told them, yeah, it can't be done. California is too broad. It should at least be 3 different states if you think about it. And as far as climates and environments, multiple, right? So I wrote just on Southern California because and that's kind of where my knowledge base is. And even then it was tough. You can't cover it all. Lifelong endeavor.
And we could put the names of those books on our website too.
Awesome.
If folks want to look there. Excuse me. Okay, the next question is from Donna Thomas. You mentioned boiling yucca blossoms. Did Kawia also roast the blossoms? Does roasting or boiling change the flavor, which tastes rather bitter to me when raw?
So you know, I don't want to limit what I think was done. I think it's probably all of the above, but the blossoms are a little bit bitter. And so, you know, what we do now is we boil them a couple times, pour it off, the parboiling, right? Pour it off, and then we will saute them. But I imagine there's a variety of ways to do it. It just takes a little experimentation and also working with someone who knows and who's done it before. That's how I learned.
Okay. Kathy Havert asks, if I were to grow a Kawaii garden of native plants, what would be the best one to plant first?
You know, that's hard to say. I mean, I don't, you know, I try not to have any kind of hierarchies of something better than anything else or whatever. Things are more of a spectrum. But I will say, you know, that just do your research and figure out. But it also depends on where you're at, right? Where I live, there's certain plants that are available, but other plants grow at lower elevations. So it's really a matter of matching. It's that custom designing, right? Matching your environment to the plants that would naturally be conducive to that environment.
And I can just mention, if you don't mind, our chapter does have a native plant sale in the fall, and that's a good place to find out more about plants that are appropriate for your area and also to purchase them. So you can check our website, our social media for that as well. So there's a note from John Pinson. Akima, good to see you, and thanks, Gerald. Just no question, just hello. Actually, another question about books, and then Kate Kramer has a question: how can we, as a California Native Plant Society members, support Indigenous cultures? Well,
so one of the things that I suffer from is Zoom fatigue. And also, there's something that some of you may have heard of. I still haven't experienced it myself. It's called free time. Because I'm always doing things like this, and you know, to be honest with you, it's frustrating and it's kind of a burden that it's place, you know, the burden to teach humanity, all of California, about this knowledge, and you know, each of you have a responsibility to learn this stuff, right? Land acknowledgments now are kind of popular, right? And so you're acknowledging maybe whose lands you are on or what have you, maybe not so much acknowledging the damage that's been done to the people or the environment. But I would say just do your research. You should know this stuff. And also, if you have any kind of stereotypical beliefs about natives, about culture, about nature, then you're a colonist, you're a settler, you know? So you have to do a little soul searching, I think. And what is it what is it that I can do? And like I said, I'm always, I guess I'm the trash man around here, you know? I'm always pulling over and picking up trash or whatever. And that's something, that's a simple thing that anybody can do, right? Lobby your county governments, the state governments, the federal governments to do more, to listen and to actually implement these practices.
Great. So I have a note from Dr. Kat Louib. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Thank you for sharing. I would love to visit and learn more from you as I continue to share my own lineage of Filipino indigenous medicine from the Philippines. And then the next question is from Jared Aldern. Please tell us about Kawia cultural burning practices today.
Well, I will tell you that there is a certain plant that grows on my reservation that is used by the basket makers, and they come from all over Southern California to gather here it's actually my cousin's land, and there's a state highway that goes right through the middle of this patch. And so she's been wanting to burn off part of that plant because it's starting to get overgrown, and burning it would actually help the plant. But because there's a state highway there, we were like, oh yeah, this is a good idea. And then CAL FIRE gets involved, Caltrans gets involved, the Bureau of Indian Affairs gets involved, and before you know it, nothing happens because of all the red tape, right? So it's very difficult, and particularly the basket weavers. I recommend all of you researching the California Indian Basket Weavers Association. And basket weaving is an art form, right? But you can't be a basket weaver without also being a botanist, a climatologist, right? Your knowledge of our spiritual traditions. It's like this all-encompassing act, right, or activity. And like the CIBA, California Indian Basket Weavers Association, they've actually lobbied state government, right, because some of the public utilities are spraying herbicides and poisons underneath their power lines. And some of these plants that these basket weavers use grow in those areas, right? So it's a multi-layered kind of impact, I think, that happens. And fire, right? The whole idea of fighting fire, the firefighter, right? As opposed to seeing it more as a renewal, right? And that's the other thing, this idea of natural resources, right? Using nature, right, to develop wealth, and fire is in opposition to that. And that's why the American idea of fire is as a destructive force, whereas for many of us, it's a renewing force.
Okay, thanks. Here's a question from an anonymous person that says, are you able to call out any particular dangerous non-native plants that threaten native plants?
I don't know if I know any specific plants. Certainly there are a number of invasive species. I think, one key one is eucalyptus trees. They are not indigenous to these lands. They're sucking up all the water. Here we are in drought, and we're talking about cutbacks and not having enough water, and yet these trees were introduced, right? And they were actually introduced with a commercial interest, and we need to get rid of those trees.
Great. Maureen Boren asks, how do you feel about the practice of land acknowledgement, and is there a preferred position that you feel should be taken if an acknowledgement is formulated?
Well, so land acknowledgements, you have to understand, land acknowledgements aren't really for native people. They're for the non-natives, right? We already know whose land it is. And so in addition to acknowledging that it was our land, I'd like to have some of this genocide acknowledged, the damage to our I have inherited intergenerational trauma. I have the potential of being a third generation alcoholic, right? And it pains me to say that, but it's the truth. And why is that? It's because my grandparents were taken away and sent to boarding school. It's because we were told we were spiritual but not intelligent. It's because we weren't allowed to start our own businesses. It was because we weren't allowed to gather our plants or sing our songs or speak our language, And so as far as land acknowledgements, acknowledge the history, acknowledge what was done. And it's not just about whose land it is, it's what's happened to the people.
Thank you. Let's see, the next question is from Ivan Torres. You mentioned the use of fire as a renewing force. In the past couple of years, we've seen huge fires overtaking parts of California and becoming this type of new normal where we can expect them year after year. Is there any political movement currently towards providing stewardship to Native people to use these kinds of control burns to clear forests and prevent huge fires?
I recommend there's a documentary series on KCET out of LA called Tending the Wild. And there's one episode with Chairman Ron Good where they're doing cultural burning. And when they do an area like that, it actually increases the amount of water in the ground, you know, right? And it's almost like counterintuitive to think that's true, but then it all makes sense once you get into it. But to be honest with you, I think I tried to start a fire department in 2008 for my tribe, and all I got was opposition from the county, from the state, because I didn't realize fire management, fire suppression is big business. And I thought it was about protecting, you know, our environment, protecting our people, but no. And so I think we still have a long way to go. They'll say, oh yeah, that's a good idea, this cultural burning and stuff, but there's no buy-in by California or by America in general. And that's I think that's still decades away.
Okay. Manuel Zarate asks, how can organizations like the California Native Plant Society and Native cultures work with schools across California to connect them to the specific land around their schools, such as bringing learning outdoors and making it a core part of the curriculum?
You know, I think, you know, I talked a good bit today about this reciprocal obligation in these long-term relationships. I recommend that any organization and any of you on this call here form a relationship with your local tribal communities, and it's not about asking them to teach you. It's not about asking them to provide you with plants or knowledge or anything like that. It's what can you do to help that tribal community. I think once you do that, then you know there can be some real positive changes that happen. But most of the time, it's the opposite. People want stuff from tribal communities. They want stuff from tribal people and culture bearers, and that's not reciprocity. That's just taking. That's mining. That's just like the gold mine. But now we have this kind of intellectual mining that's going on in tribal communities.
Okay, that's really, I appreciate that. Thank you. Jan Byers asks, I'm reading a book about braiding sweetgrass, the book about braiding sweetgrass. It expresses the concept you shared very well, mostly Midwestern and Eastern ecological examples. The focus on reciprocity with plants and animals. Are you familiar with the book, and is there something similar more focused on California biomes? And she says, besides Kat Anderson's excellent book.
You know, I am familiar with braiding sweetgrass. You know, I don't know specifically newer publications that are focused specifically on California environments or even Southern California environments. That Kat Anderson book tends to be kind of the go-to resource, I think.
Okay, thanks. Colin Barrows asks, what are some of the steps we can take living in Kawia territory to work towards implementing tech as a community?
You know, I don't know how to answer that. I think supporting tribal initiatives, supporting local tribal governments. You know, there are, one of the things I tell my students in my Native Studies classes is that at some point, all of us, and for those of you who are in California, you're going to get the opportunity to vote on some kind of law, right, or measure here in California that's going to impact tribal communities. And I tell my students, I don't care how you vote, I just want you to make an informed decision. And the vast majority of citizens here in California have no concept of traditional ecological knowledge. They have very little concept of the tribal communities here in California. And at best, they know a little bit about the missions and they know a little bit about casinos, you know, so they can go see their favorite 80s band, right? But, you know, it's taking on, every one of us have a responsibility to take on doing the research and understanding the history of the land where you live. And that includes the Native people that were here and are here.
Great, thank you. Bailey McKernan asks, have you had to deal with conflicts in your research or your profession with people not valuing and viewing your knowledge as real science, like with the Western research paradigm versus the Indigenous research paradigm?
Well, so I mentioned that Tending the Wild documentary series there at KCET, and it's, don't get me wrong, it's a good series, but it always cracks me up where they have some tribal elder that just like shares some just amazing wisdom, and then the knee jerk is to then bring in the non-native PhD to say the same damn thing, and then all of a sudden everybody's like, oh, okay. You know, it's that validation. I see that all over the place. And you know, like the chapter that that I contributed for this book, I don't think it's necessarily academic writing. I think it's accessible writing. And for me, even as an artist, I think about people who look at my artwork. I want to make things that are accessible. So we have this kind of communication that's going on, this reciprocal communication.
Great, thanks. Lisa Shower, I may not be saying that right. Thank you for the beautiful talk and for sharing your wisdom. In regard to foraging, do you have any thoughts as to how we might discourage the emerging foraging by colonizers trend? I feel like I'm seeing more and more posts online where SoCal non-Indigenous people are learning to forage in what seems to be a really disrespectful and unsustainable way, but the reaction to attempts to educate is usually quite negative. Did you get that?
Yeah, and I know what they're talking about, and it's frustrating. And you know, I talked about how Daniel McCarthy helped the tribes, and we had to battle. They had to fight to get these gathering permits, and now you see people coming up from the cities and going into the forest and gathering, and you know, it's problematic, right? Because on one hand, by doing that act, you begin to, you know, like take interest and have a personal passion for the plants and the environment. But at the same time, you know, they're undermining and supplanting the people who've been here for thousands of years, right? And I'll say that there's a just because you can go out and get these plants doesn't mean you're going to do it right, right? And it's you know, like I said, today's talk is just the very, very tip of the iceberg, and it's a lifelong practice. And most people don't seem to be willing to do the work.
Okay. Victoria Chubb just offered a link to the Mulkey Museum website where you can purchase actually Tamalpah through that. And it's Mulkey, I'll just say briefly, Mulkey with an I, MALKI museum, all one word, .org. And if you go to that website, you can find it. And we can also post that. So Alvin Rose Figueroa has a question, more so a comment, but everything we do as Indigenous people fits into the ecological system. That's just a comment. Then Marcia Stone asks, is there a written source for ancient Indigenous stories?
Actually, like there are a number, you know, one of the books I was also going to share in terms of some knowledge and creation, stories and legends of the Palm Springs Indians. And basically this was narrated from Francisco Potencio from the Agua Caliente band. And this was copyrighted in 1943. So I don't know if you can still get that. But you see, I have a couple pages listed here. And one of the pages I listed, it actually goes through and talks about plants and the first plants after the death of the creator. I won't go into the creation story, but plants are part of our story. They're part of our ideology. And even the twin creators, you know, being a teacher is a sacred thing. What does America tell us? Well, those who can't teach, which is the complete opposite of our belief system, which is teaching is a very sacred act. That's why I'm here right now.
Hey, let's see. So William Hammond has a question. What do you think about the suggestion to turn the national parks over to tribal nations?
You know, that's part of that whole land back movement that we're seeing right now. I like the idea. I think it would be a process. I teach at UC Riverside, and Riverside, that area was shared by a number of tribes through history in this kind of ebb and flowing, you know. So there would be a lot of research discussions that would have to be made about who are we giving it back to, right? And what tribe can claim this land or that? There's still, it sounds good, but I still think there's a lot more thought that needs to be put into that.
Okay. Let's see. Thank you, Gerald, for sharing your tech. Would you kindly speak to how the arts and your art practices are an integral part of tech?
Well, so I currently have a show. It actually closes after tomorrow at the Palm Springs Art Museum, 80 works over 30 years. And several of my paintings and sculptures are of the plants that we discussed today. And so I include those in my art expression. I've made a lot of bad art over the years, but it always seems like the best works come from my own personal experience. And like I said, my daughters and I, we go out and we gather. And so that ends up working its way into my art practice. I also run my family's cattle ranch, which we've been doing for a long time as well. And even that practice ends up in my art practice. And that seems like when the art is most, I don't know, real, most honest, and makes connections with people.
Right, thanks. Chris Wagner says, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I will be working more closely with local tribes as I'm developing the Tribal Relations Management Plan for the Department of Defense. This type of information is so valuable and allows us to understand tribal life in a deeper way. The Department of Defense strives to form deeper relationships. I'm excited to work on this. I guess there's actually no question there, just a comment. And then another question, what are your thoughts on the Desert X Indian Land art piece in Palm Springs?
Well, it just so happens I was on a panel last night about Desert X, and Nicholas Galanan's Never Forget is the title. And I very much supported the work. I thought it brought attention to both the fact that that's Kawia land, but also the fact that it's the land back movement, right? And some people said, oh, well, it says Indian land, it should say Kawia land, it should be more specific and all that. But, like even in my artwork, I use stereotypes and I use common knowledge as a way to engage people. And, had it said Kawia land, there would have been people who wouldn't have understood what that even is, right? And by saying Indian land, I think it starts the conversation. And once that conversation starts, then hopefully people arrive to that idea that, oh yeah, it is Kawia land. And even that, is it Kawia land, or what clan within the Agua Caliente was that homeland to, right? So it depends on how specific you want to get. But I support, any kind of creative endeavor that promotes conversation and promotes thought, I think is a great thing.
Arlie Montalvo says, just a note that on CNPS on field trips, we talk about indigenous uses of plants. Arlie has a question about differences in Juncus textilis in different areas. She says, I have heard that there is a color difference in the population on the reservation near Anza compared to elsewhere. What might you know about that?
Actually, I don't know anything about that. I think my cousin, who's a basket maker, would know, or other California basket weavers would know that. But I don't really have knowledge of the color differences.
Okay, thanks. And Arlie also wanted to note that for everyone's benefit, permission is needed to collect plants just about everywhere. Permits are required on government lands, and the California Native Plant Society has policies as well. And a new policy about collecting plants for educational purposes is likely to be released. So everyone should certainly take care and make sure you know what the rules are with regard to plant collection. Let's see, here's what, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I would just add that the one of the issues is there's no enforcement. They forced us to have these permits and such, but there's very little law enforcement that are out in the forests monitoring these things, right?
Yeah.
So it takes people discipline, right, to say, no, I'm not going to do this.
Here's a related question, perhaps. Bailey McKernan asks, what about gathering non-native weeds?
Oh yeah, there's a number of invasive species that are edible. Someone, I think it was several years ago, they did a plant tour of the Santa Ana riverbed, and they were showing all the different invasive species that are edible. And in today's world where people are going hungry, heck yeah, get out there and eat that stuff.
Yeah, take as much as you want on the non-natives. So Gail Wesson is asking, who published the Stories and Legends book? Do you have the publisher so she could search for a copy?
I think it may have been published by the Palm Springs Desert Museum. So I think
okay.
that was, I believe that was the Palm Springs Art Museum
Yes.
in its earlier, incantation or incarnation as a history museum.
Maybe we could ask them. That is the Palm Springs Desert Museum used to have a natural history aspect, and it was the now the art museum. Okay, Gail Wilson has another question, or actually a comment. Please tell Gerald there were about 6 of us watching the Antique Roadshow video at the Palm Springs Desert Museum on Thursday. I wish the exhibit would last longer than Sunday.
Yeah, it closes tomorrow, indeed.
And then Bailey McKernan mentions, I'm at University of California, Santa Barbara, and I'm working with Mia Lopez of the Coastal Band of Chumash Indians on creating a guide to edible weeds. So there we go. Let's see, I don't have any other questions. If anybody else does have a question, please put it in the Q&A. I'm going to take a quick look and see if there might have gotten any questions in the chat. Oh wait, I'm sorry, here comes one more, a couple more. Claudia Armenta asks, how do you feel about sage being sold? Also, how do you feel about them being wrapped with roses and lavender?
Well, I haven't seen the roses and lavender thing, but I will say I don't like it being sold, whether it's at Marshall's or if it's some health food store or even a swap meet. I don't like seeing it, because part of what they're losing is, for all of us, going out into the environment and collecting it yourself. I think it matters so much more. And I don't recommend any of you going out and gathering it in the forest, but you can certainly plant it in your yard, and you can go out and gather it that way, right? You propagate your own supply. I do the same thing. I grow tobacco. This is what piba is our word when we pray. So I always grow tobacco here at my house instead of going out and gathering it. And that way I could, I have a supply close, but also I'm not going out and taking more and more plants. And then at the end of the season, I save the seed.
Okay. Let's see. Another question from Jennifer Prado. Are there current efforts to relearn traditional uses that are currently not known, but may have been lost?
Well, when you're, if you get that Tamalpach book, it says in the introduction that there were a couple hundred plants, I think, that were identified in the book, but there were also, they heard stories from elders, as it was Lowell Bean and Catherine C. LaSable, when they did these interviews with these various knowledgeable people, typically women who are knowledgeable in these plants and medicines. And they came across some stories, but they never could identify the actual plant. So some of this has indeed been lost, and that's why it's important for us to preserve what we still have.
Mm-hmm. Great. Let's see. I don't think I have any more questions. There are quite a few comments in the chat, and thanking you for the wonderful time and your sharing your knowledge. And let's see, I'm just trying to scan real quick. Are there any, if anybody else has a question, you can type it quickly into the Q&A so we can find it. But lots of, I think it was really wonderful presentation, and thanks for helping us to think about some things that maybe we aren't always aware of in terms of awareness of Indigenous cultures. I think that's really helpful.
Well, can I say, I highly recommend this not be the end of this discussion, but that you seek out some of these other really wonderful, they're my heroes. And you know, they know so much more than I do. And I recommend, you know, reaching out and finding these people and continuing this conversation, because this is a lifelong endeavor, and you're constantly learning about these things. And you know, it's the same with me, you know, in my artwork. I hope to be doing the best artwork I physically can possible, right? The day before I pass, you know. And until then, I'm learning. I'm learning, and that's what it's all about.
I do have one more question that popped up from Michelle Roman. What would be the best way to get in touch with Kawia elders or elders of other tribes? I have tried with various tribes and was only somewhat successful with the Northern Paiute. I used to live in Anza and now live in Hemet.
Well, I would just say two things. First of all, leave those poor people alone, because again, this idea of you know, spare time is becoming more and more rare, it seems like. But so there are, you know, there are books and there are things, and just keep your eyes open and such. But you know, it's exhausting. It's exhausting to continue to do these things, right? And I feel very good about what we've done this morning. But there's, you know, other people, you know, you just continue to. I've been on task force where, you know, I've spent 6 months doing this process, and in the end, they're like, okay, thanks, and then it's over, and there's nothing else that happens. So it's kind of frustrating, I have to say. And so I would just like, you know, do your research, but what you don't want to do is mine, right? You don't want to mine psychologically, right? Educationally mine these cultures. Do what you can, go to cultural events anytime you can, support these tribes and these tribal communities any way you can, and be patient. When I went to learn Kawia bird songs from my elder, I showed up to, his name was Albino Siva. I showed up to his house and I introduced myself and who my people were. And he said, oh, that's nice. And he said, you see that pile of wood over there? And I said, yeah. And he said, can you stack that up for me? And I was like, oh, yeah, sure. So I went and stacked the wood, and I went back and told him I was done. I was all hot and sweaty, you know. He said, okay, thank you. And he closed the door. And so a week later, I go back, and he says, oh, yeah, you're back. He said, you remember that wood you cut or stacked? I said, yeah. He said, can you actually bring it over here and stack it near the house so my wife and I can get it in easier? And I was like, oh, yeah, sure. And then the same thing happened. He said, okay, thank you, bye. And he closes the door. It was only the third time that I went back. And he said, hey, come inside. I want to teach you a song. And I had to prove myself. I had to prove to him that I wanted to know and that I was willing to do the work to know this stuff. And it's the same for all of you, right? It's, you got to prove yourself, and it's that reciprocal relationship, right? That obligation. You have to prove to the community that you're not just mining, that you're not just taking, that you're also willing to give. So you have to be patient, and you have to be willing to give in order to get.
Well, if you're willing, I've got one more question, which is from Erica Paz. Can you speak about the relationship of local Indigenous people and Mexican people mixed with Indigenous peoples of the South?
You know, that's I don't know if I have that book close. The Kumeyaay, right? That border is completely arbitrary. And keep in mind, this used to be Mexico, right? So the Kumeyaay have been halved, and they've got family and cousins across the border, and they practice very similar cultural practices, right? And so, yeah, they're all very similar, I think, and you have to break down your own kind of divisions. Like, for instance, I teach in the ethnic studies department, and so many people think ethnic studies like divides society into these individual groups, right? Native American, Asian American, African American, etc. And I don't, that's not how I teach ethnic studies. I think when it's taught properly, and not just politically, but spiritually, that it brings people together. And that I think that's I think what we're talking about today, everything that we've talked about today, should be bringing people together.
Okay. I actually just discovered some other questions. Do you have a few more minutes? Is that okay?
Sure.
I'll make it quick. Sorry, I think I can try to condense these. There were some in the answered. So one quick question is, when we see non-native and irresponsible harvesting, who do we report that to? I think you've commented on that already, but.
Yeah, that's, there's no law enforcement that protects this stuff. They'll protect trees, because that's lumber, that's wealth. They'll protect certain things, whereas if someone's just gathering acorns, it seems like there's no buy-in on making that important.
Okay, let's see. I'm just looking. Some of these are comments. I'll save those. Is a permit needed to harvest yucca because of the problems with unsustainable harvesting?
Yeah, you pretty much you have to pretty much be an enrolled native citizen here in California, in this area, in order to get one of these permits to do that. But I will tell you, a couple years ago, a lot of people move up into this area off the reservation from the city. And one time I saw a lady, and she was in her shiny new pickup truck, and she had dug up an entire yucca that had stalked and was bloomed. And I imagine she was planning on, like replanting it in her yard. But those of you who know the yucca plant, once it blooms and seeds, it dies. And so these kinds of things are just infuriating. And this idea of, Kawia not having this concept of nature, I take that kind of stuff personally. It hurts me when I see people abusing the plants and the animals. And even, just a couple of months ago, someone hit a deer on the highway, and someone called me up, and me and my brother-in-law got it, and we butchered it out. Until recently, that was against the law, and we could have been fined and maybe even spend a night in jail for doing that. So the law was designed to make that animal go to waste, and it's just horrible. So luckily, that's kind of changed, but the harvesting of animals as well as plants, it happens a lot, but there's no system in place to really protect these things.
Okay. Great. Well, actually, that's all the questions I see. There are some folks who've asked if there's a way that they can contact you. I'm assuming that if they go to your website, that might be the way to do that.
Yeah, that's the way of doing it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so just as a reminder, that's www.geraldclarke, Clarke with an E.net.
That's it.
So great. Well, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. We appreciate the extra time in answering lots of questions. I think we ended up with a really good audience today, and we really appreciate the time you spent with us. So thanks.
Yeah, appreciate the invitation, and appreciate everyone's time and energy put into today's lecture.
Great. Well, thanks everybody. Have a good afternoon, and don't forget to get to the museum by tomorrow to see.
Yeah, I will say you have to get your tickets ahead of time, because it's like a timed entry. So if anyone wants to do that, you got to do it online. Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.